We often attempt to measure Alexander the Great with maps. We trace arrows across continents. We count the cities he named after himself. But if we want to truly understand the anatomy of his power, we cannot start with the glory of conquest. We must start with the intimacy of a murder. The year is 336 BC. The location is the theater at Asia, the ceremonial capital of Macedonia. Philip II, the most feared man in the Western world, walks into the arena. A is Uner Med, he is wearing white. He is celebrating the wedding of his daughter. Philip is at the absolute zenith of his career. He has crushed the Greek city-states into submission. He has built a military machine unlike anything the world has ever seen. He is days away from launching the invasion of Persia. But Philip makes one fatal mistake. He believes his power makes him untouchable. He waves away his bodyguards to show the crowd that he is loved. And in that moment of hubris, a dagger strikes. Pausanias, a disgruntled bodyguard, drives a blade into the king's ribs. Philip falls. The crowd screams. And as the assassin is brutally silenced by the spears of the royal guards, we must look away from the blood. We must turn our gaze to the 20-year-old boy watching from the shadows. Alexander. He does not panic. He does not weep. In the anatomy of power, there is a brutal rule. When a god falls, a monster must rise to take his place. Philip's death tore a massive hole in the fabric of the world, and Alexander stepped into that void instantly. To understand the terrifying nature of the king he was about to become, we have to dissect his psychological DNA. Alexander was not a natural phenomenon. He was a product engineered by two brilliant, toxic architects. First, his father, Philip. Philip was a man of the earth. Rough, scarred, a heavy drinker, and a pragmatist. He took a kingdom of shepherds and turned them into the Spartans' worst nightmare. He gave Alexander the hardware of war. But this was not just about courage. It was about mechanics. Philip handed his son the Sarissa Pycon, 18-foot monstrosity that transforms soldiers into an impenetrable, moving forest of iron. The genius of this weapon was undeniable. The Sarissa was so long that the pikes of the first 5 rows projected beyond the front of the formation. Any enemy attacking from the front had to fight through 5 layers of steel points before they could even touch a Macedonian soldier. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was a meat grinder, designed to hold any line, anywhere. But Philip left his son something else, besides this machine. A deep, corrosive insecurity. Alexander grew up in a state of panic. Every time news arrived that Philip had taken another city, Alexander would not celebrate. He would turn to his friends with tears in his eyes and say, "My father will conquer everything, and leave nothing great for me to show the world." He viewed his father not as a mentor, but as a rival who was stealing his destiny. Then, there was the second architect, his mother, Olympia. If Philip was the engineer of reality, Olympias was the architect of fantasy. She was a woman of terrifying intensity, a devotee of the mystery cults who slept with snakes in her bed. She loathed Philip, and she whispered a dangerous secret into Alexander's ear from the moment he could understand language. She told him, "Philip is not your father. The night you were conceived, lightning struck my womb. Your true father is Zeus, the king of gods." Imagine the impact of that lie on a developing mind. It severed Alexander from humanity. It forged a conviction in his brain. The laws of men do not apply to you. Fear is for mortals. Pain is for mortals. Limits are for mortals. But you are divine. So when Philip took his last breath on the theater floor, Alexander did not just inherit a throne. He inherited a volatile contradiction, the supreme military efficiency of a king, and the limitless, delusional entitlement of a god. His first act of power was not a speech. It was a purge. This is the moment the romantic hero dies, and the tyrant is born. Alexander moved with the speed of a predator. He understood that respect takes years to build, but terror takes only days. He executed his cousin Amyntas, the true heir by blood. He executed the 2 princes of Lyncestis, simply because they had a claim to the throne. But the darkest moment came from his mother. Philip had a new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and a newborn infant. They represented a threat to Alexander's legitimacy. Olympias took charge. In a cold act of dynastical housekeeping, she ensured the infant was erased from existence, casting the child into oblivion to ensure the line of Philip would end with Alexander. She then forced the young mother to take her own life. Alexander did not commit the act, but he did not punish his mother for it. He accepted the horror. He accepted the death of an innocent life as the necessary price of the crown. The message to the Macedonian nobility was clear. The days of Philip's pragmatic politics were over. Oppose Alexander, and you will be erased. He then turned his fury south. When the city of Thebes rebelled, thinking he was just a confused boy, Alexander didn't just defeat them. He annihilated them. He razed the city to the ground, turning one of Greece's greatest powers into a graveyard of ash and silence. Yet, amidst the slaughter, he spared only one house, the home of the poet. He wanted the world to know he was a man of culture, even as he sold 30,000 citizens into slavery. Silence fell over Greece. He was no longer a boy. He was a natural disaster. With his backyard silenced by the grave, Alexander turned his eyes east, toward the Persian Empire. Historians often argue about why he invaded. Was it for gold? Was it for revenge? Was it to liberate the Greek colonies? No. These are rational reasons, and Alexander was not driven by reason. He was driven by a word the Greeks called pathos, an overwhelming, unquenchable longing for the unknown. But deeper than that, he was running away. He was invading Persia because Macedonia was too small to contain his ego. He was invading to outrun the ghost of his father. He had to perform a miracle so large that it would eclipse everything Philip had ever done. He marched his army to the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. As his ship approached the beach, Alexander did not wait for it to dock. In full armor, he leaped into the surf. He threw his spear with all his might. It soared through the air and buried itself deep into the Asian sand. He declared that this entire continent was now Spear One land, a gift from the gods to him. It was a claim over millions of lives and thousands of years of history. It was madness, but he had the army to back it up. He had started a war he could not stop. The engine was running, and this machine, built by Philip and driven by a man who thought he was Zeus, was hungry. It needed to move, it needed to consume. But this time the enemy was not a rebel city. Just across the horizon, waiting to crush this upstart boy, was Darius III, the King of Kings, commanding the resources of half the known world and a 1,000,000-man army. The collision was inevitable. When the spear landed in the Asian sand, the applause of the soldiers masked a terrifying reality. The propaganda painted Alexander as a wealthy conqueror coming to claim his birthright. But the accounting books told a different story. The invasion of Persia was not a crusade. It was a desperate gamble by a bankrupt state. When Alexander launched this campaign, the Macedonian treasury was practically empty. He owed 1,300 talents to his creditors. In modern terms, the most powerful army in the world was insolvent. They had enough grain to feed the men for 30 days, maybe less. This sets the stage for the true mechanism of the kinetic engine. Alexander did not have the luxury of patience. He could not wait for the enemy to make a mistake. He could not lay siege to cities. For years, he had to kill, and he had to plunder. If the army stopped moving, it would starve. The first test of this desperate momentum came at the river. The local Persian governors had gathered on the opposite bank. They had the high ground, they had a massive cavalry force, and they had a deep, rushing river protecting them. Their strategy was sound. Block the crossing, starve the Macedonians, and watch the invasion collapse. Alexander's generals, old men who had served under Philip, begged him to wait. They wanted to attack at dawn. They wanted to find a shallow ford. They wanted to use strategy. Alexander ignored them. He looked at the river, and he did something that defied all military logic. He ordered a direct charge, immediately, uphill, through the water, into the teeth of the Persian cavalry. It was a suicide mission, but it was calculated madness. Alexander knew that to break the Persian will, he had to show them that he did not respect their geography. He mounted his horse, Bucephalus, and led the charge himself, not from the back, but at the very tip of the wedge. The ensuing melee was chaotic. In the crush of bodies and splashing water, Alexander was targeted. He was wearing a helmet with 2 massive white plumes. He made himself a beacon for every enemy sword. A Persian noble named Spitherdates saw him. He rode up behind Alexander, raised a massive battle axe, and brought it down with crushing force. The axe sheared off one of Alexander's white plumes and cracked through the helmet. The blade touched his hair. Alexander was dazed. As the Persian raised the axe for the killing blow, the blow that would have ended the great history before it even began, a shadow intervened. Cletus, the Black. Cletus was the commander of the royal guard, and Alexander's childhood friend. In a split second, Cletus struck. His blade intercepted the axe, cutting down the attacker instantly. Alexander survived by a fraction of a second, but the message was sent. The Persians had never seen a king fight like a demon in the mud. They broke. However, muscle alone would not conquer Asia. Alexander needed to prove something else, that he was destined to rule. He marched his army to the ancient city of Gor. In the center of the city stood an ox cart, tied with a knot of cornel bark so complex, so twisted, that the ends were invisible. Legend said that whoever untied this knot would become the Lord of Asia. For centuries, kings and wise men had tried and failed. Alexander approached the knot. Studied Italiano. He pulled at the strands. It wouldn't budge. The crowd held its breath. If he failed, the superstition would turn against him. But Alexander didn't try to solve the puzzle. He stepped back, drew his sword, and slashed through the knot in a single, violent stroke. He didn't untie it. He destroyed the problem. It was a declaration to the world. I do not follow your rules. Primera brea. Caden. He had the will. He had the myth. But as they pushed deeper into the vastness of Asia, the enemy changed. The challenge was no longer just soldiers or knots. It was distance. Let us dissect the logistics of this beast. 50,000 men, 6,000 horses. To keep this biological machine alive, Alexander needed to secure roughly 100 tons of wheat and 300,000 gallons of water. Every single day. This is where the genius of the Macedonian system shines. Philip had banned the use of ox carts, which were slow. Instead, the soldiers carried their own equipment. The army was lean, fast, and constantly hungry. They operated on a principle of predatory expansion. They ate what they conquered. Alexander studied the harvest cycles of the Persian province. He timed his marches to hit the grain silos just as they were filled. He wasn't just a general. He was a master of supply chain management in a hostile environment. But the Persians were not stupid. The great king, Darius III, finally realized that this was not a border raid. This was an existential threat. Darius assembled the full might of the empire. He brought an army so vast that it reportedly shook the ground as it marched. He maneuvered behind Alexander, cutting off his supply lines. He forced Alexander to fight on a narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus. This is the moment of truth. Starvation was behind them. A massive army was in front of them. Darius sat in his golden chariot, surrounded by his immortals. He expected the Macedonians to be intimidated by the sheer scale of his force. But Alexander saw the battlefield differently. He saw it as a geometry problem. He deployed his army in the classic hammer and anvil formation. The anvil was the phalanx, those men with the long sarissa pikes. Their job was not to win. Their job was to die standing up. They had to hold the massive Persian line, enduring wave after wave of attacks, buy in time. The hammer was Alexander and his companion cavalry. As the battle raged and the phalanx began to buckle under the weight of the Persian numbers, Alexander saw his opening. A slight gap in the Persian line. He didn't signal a general advance. He signaled a surgical strike. He formed his cavalry into a giant wedge and drove it straight at the person of Darius. He ignored the foot soldiers. He ignored the flankers. He rode directly for the king. Imagine the psychological shock. In the Persian code of war, the king directs from a distance. In Alexander's code, the king is the spear point. When Darius saw this warrior covered in the grime of war charging through his royal guards, looking him directly in the eyes, his nerve failed. The King of Kings turned his chariot around and fled. When the army saw their god king running, the structure collapsed. The engine had done the impossible. It had shattered the leadership of the world's superpower. The loot captured after Issus was beyond comprehension. Thousands of tons of gold. The engine was no longer running on fumes. It was drowning in luxury. Alexander had achieved everything. He had paid his debts. He had humiliated the East. He was now the wealthiest man who had ever lived. By all logic, the kinetic engine should have stopped. The soldiers wanted to go home. They wanted to spend their gold. But here lies the tragedy of the system. The engine was designed to conquer. It was not designed to govern. And the driver of the engine, Alexander, had tasted something more addictive than wine. He had tasted absolute dominion. He looked at the empty throne of Darius, and he sat in it. It was too big for him. His feet didn't touch the ground. But he liked the view. He didn't want to be a Macedonian king anymore. The rough, brotherhood-based leadership of his father Philip was no longer enough. He looked at the bowing Persians, the prostrating subjects, and he decided that this was the kind of respect he deserved. The war against Persia was over, but the war against his own identity was just beginning. The kinetic engine was about to turn inward, and the first victim would not be a Persian enemy. It would be the man who saved his life at the river Cletus, the Black. Victory has a peculiar taste. For some, it is sweet. For Alexander, it was intoxicating. The kinetic engine had stopped. The Persian Empire was conquered. Darius was dead, his body left in a wagon by his own treacherous generals. Alexander stood as the undisputed master of the known world, but without a word of fight. The monster inside him began to starve, and when it couldn't eat enemies, it started to eat its own tail. We now enter the most claustrophobic phase of the anatomy of power, the metamorphosis. It started with the clothes. One morning, Alexander walked out of his tent, not wearing the simple tunic of a Macedonian soldier, but the purple and white robes of a Persian king. He placed the diadema white band of royalty upon his head. To the soldiers, the purple robes were not silk. They were a betrayal, a visual scream that their king had become the enemy. They whispered in the mess halls. They said he was menacing, becoming one of them. They said he had forgotten who his father was. But Alexander was not just playing dress-up. He was attempting a massive political experiment. He wanted to fuse the Macedonian and Persian cultures into a single, hybrid race. To prove his commitment, he did the unthinkable. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess. She was the daughter of a local warlord, a woman from the very edges of civilization. The wedding was a spectacle of fusion. Alexander, the son of Zeus, holding hands with the barbarian. He encouraged his officers to do the same, to take Persian wives, to dilute their Macedonian blood with the blood of the conquered. He was trying to create a world where us and them no longer existed. But to the old guard, the men who had marched with Philip, this was not vision. This was heresy. The tension in the camp grew thick. Paranoia began to seep into Alexander's mind. He no longer saw brothers. He saw potential assassins. And then, he found his excuse to purge them. Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry, was accused of failing to report a vague conspiracy against the king. Philotas was arrogant, yes, but was he a traitor? Probably not. It didn't matter. Alexander ordered his arrest. He watched as his former friend was subjected to harsh interrogation, his spirit broken until he confessed to crimes he likely didn't commit. Philotas was then executed by the army, silenced under a hail of spears. But this was just the setup for the real crime. Philotas had a father, Parmenion. Parmenion was 70 years old. He was the greatest general of the previous generation. He was currently stationed back in Ecbatana, guarding the royal treasury, the billions of dollars of captured gold. Alexander knew the rules of the mafia. If you kill the son, you must kill the father, or he will use that gold to raise an army against you. Alexander sent a messenger on racing camels across the desert. The order was simple: get to Ecbatana before the news of Philotas's death does. The messenger arrived. He found the old general sitting in a garden. Parmenion smiled, thinking he was receiving a letter from his son. As he broke the seal to read it, the assassins struck. They ended the old man's life before he could finish the first sentence. There was no trial, no evidence, just cold, brutal logistics. When the head of Parmenion was delivered to Alexander, the army realized the truth. The king they loved was dead. A tyrant had taken his place. But the tragedy was spiraling toward a single, drunken night in the city of Maracanda. It was a feast day. The wine was flowing. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and unsaid grievances. Alexander, drunk and arrogant, began to boast. He claimed his victories were his alone. He mocked his father, Philip, calling him a man of small ambition compared to his own divinity. In the corner of the room sat Cletus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander from the axe at the the man whose sister had nursed Alexander when he was a baby. Cletus had had enough. He stood up, swaying with wine. He shouted back, "It was this hand, Alexander. This hand that saved you from death. You are great because of the blood of Macedonians, not because of your imaginary father Zeus." The room went silent. The musicians stopped. Alexander's face turned a terrifying shade of red. He snatched a heavy golden goblet from the table and hurled it at Cletus's head. He called for his guards, but they hesitated. Cletus was dragged from the room by friends, but he broke free. He stumbled back into the doorway, quoting a line from a tragedy. Alas, what evil customs reign in Greece. Alexander did not hesitate this time. He snatched a spear from a guard. He lunged. The spear point pierced Cletus's chest. The old soldier fell. The silence that followed was louder than any battle. Alexander stood over the body of the man who had saved his life, his hands shaking, the spear trembling in his grip. The rage evaporated instantly, replaced by a crushing horror. Alexander collapsed. He tried to turn the spear on himself, but his guards stopped him. For 3 days, He lay in his tent, refusing food, screaming Cletus's name. But tears do not wash away the sin. The last shred of his humanity died on that floor. When he finally emerged from his tent, he was colder, harder. He realized that, as long as his men saw him as a man, they would judge him. So, he decided to become something they could not judge. He decided to become a god. He attempted to introduce the ritual of Pruskin. In Persia, when you meet the king, you blow a kiss and bow to the ground. It is a sign of social respect. To the Greeks, you only bow to the ground for the gods. To bow to a man is blasphemy. Alexander organized a private dinner. He wanted to test the waters. He drank from a golden cup and passed it to his friends, expecting them to perform the ritual. One by one, the Persians bowed. Then the cup came to Callisthenes, the quaestorium, and philosopher, the man responsible for writing Alexander's legend. Callisthenes stood tall. He refused to bow. He looked the king in the eye and said, "I will not honor you as a god while you are still a man." The tension broke the room. Alexander realized his limit. He could conquer the earth, he could kill his friends, but he could not force free men to worship him. He dropped a demand for Perskinesis, but he never forgave the humiliation. The Paranoia found a target. Days later, he accused Callisthenes of treason, not because of evidence, but because the historian had dared to bruise a god's ego. Callisthenes was thrown into a cage, dragged behind the army like an animal, until he died of disease and neglect. Alexander had won every battle, but he was losing the war for his soul. He was isolated. He was surrounded by sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. And when a man has no one left to tell him no, the only direction left to go is into the abyss. He needed to move again. He needed to escape the ghosts of Parmenion, Cletus, and Callist. He turned his eyes to the edge of the map, to a place where legends said the world ended. India, the kinetic engine was broken, leaking oil, but the driver slammed his foot on the accelerator one last time. Into the rain, into the monsters, into the end. We have arrived at the edge of the map. Alexander had conquered civilization. Now, he decided to declare war on nature itself. India was not like Persia. Persia was a political problem. India was a biological nightmare. The army marched into the monsoons. For 70 days, the rain did not stop. It was a relentless, hammering deluge. The leather of their boots rotted on their feet. Their iron armor rusted. Snakes and venomous insects waged a guerrilla war against the soldiers in their sleep. The kinetic engine, once a shiny machine of precision, was now a rusted, limping beast. But Alexander dragged it forward, toward the river Hydas. Waiting for him on the other side was King Porus, and Porus had something the Persians did not. He had monsters. 2 underwater elephants stood in the mud, like great towers of flesh and ivory, to the Macedonian soldiers who had only ever seen horses. These creatures were biological tanks. The Battle of the Hydaspes was not a masterpiece of strategy like Og. It was a meat grinder. Horses are terrified of elephants. They smell the beasts and they panic. So Alexander could not use his famous cavalry charge. He had to send the phalanxmen with pikes directly into the path of the trampling giants. Imagine the horror. The rain blinding you, the mud sucking at your boots, and a 5-ton beast charging at you. Its tusks tipped with iron spikes. The Macedonians struck at the elephants' trunks with axes, desperate to stop them. The elephants, maddened by pain, rampaged through the lines, trampling friend and foe alike. Men were tossed into the air like ripe. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. Alexander won, always won. But the victory broke the spirit of his army, and it broke Alexander's heart. In Tisbat Bucephalus, the horse that had carried him since he was a teenager, finally died from his wounds. Alexander buried his horse and built a city over his bones. He was beginning to lose the only things that were truly loyal to him. He looked east. He wanted to go further to Odigange, to the ocean, to the end of the world. But the kinetic engine finally did the one thing it was never designed to do. It stopped. It stopped. At the river Hyphasis, the army went on strike. These were men who had walked 11,000 miles. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. They were covered in scars. They simply wanted to go home. Alexander was furious. He screamed. He called them cowards. He sulked in his tent like Achilles, waiting for them to apologize. But for 3 days, there was only silence. The men stood on the riverbank, weeping, but they did not move. Alexander realized a terrifying truth. A king without an army is just a man standing in the rain, he conceded. He turned back. It was his first defeat, and he did not take it well. If he could not conquer forward, he would punish them on the way back. Instead of taking the safe route home, Alexander ordered the army to march through the Gedrosian desert. It was a doomed route, a hellscape of salt and burning sand, where no army had ever survived intact. This was not strategy. This was spite. The march was a catastrophe. The heat was so intense that men died simply by standing still. The baggage train was lost. Supplies ran out. Desperation took hold. Soldiers were forced to slaughter their transport animals just to drink the fluids from their body. 3/4 of the army that entered the desert never came out. In the middle of this hell, a famous moment occurred. A soldier found a small amount of water in a helmet, barely a mouthful. He brought it to Alexander. The king was parched, his lips cracked and bleeding. The entire army watched, their eyes wide with thirst. Alexander took the helmet. He looked at his dying men, and he poured the precious water into the sand. "It is no use," he said. "If I drink, it will only increase the thirst of the others." It was a flash of the old Alexander, the leader who shared the pain. But it was too little, too late. When the survivors finally stumbled into Babylon, they were ghosts. The kinetic engine was destroyed, and the driver was running out of time. Alexander was 32 years old. His body was covered in old wounds. His liver was failing from years of heavy drinking. His soul was crushed by the death of Ephesian, his closest companion, who had died weeks earlier. Alexander hosted a final banquet. He drank a massive bowl of unmixed wine to numb the pain. Escrimed. He was carried to his bed. The fever took him. For 10 days, the god king withered away. He could no longer speak. He could only move his eyes. The soldiers, hearing rumors of his death, forced their way into the palace. They filed past his bed, crying, saying goodbye to the man who had led them to the end of the world. On June 11th, 323 BC, his generals gathered around his deathbed. The air was thick with anticipation. They asked him the most important question in history. "Alexander, to whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander struggled to breathe. He whispered one final word, "Kratistos, to the strongest." He didn't leave it to his son. He didn't leave it to his generals. He threw his crown into a ring of wolves. He knew what would happen. He knew that without his singular will, the machine would explode. Alexander died, and the bloodbath began immediately. His generals didn't mourn him. They tore his legacy apart. Ptolemy hijacked the funeral cart and stole Alexander's body, taking it to Egypt to validate his own rule. Seleucus carved out a massive kingdom in the east. Cassander, in a bid for power, murdered Alexander's mother, his wife Roxana, and his young son. The empire was fractured, never to be united again. So, what is the anatomy of power? We started this journey looking at a young man who wanted to escape his father's shadow. We ended looking at a corpse that cast a shadow over history for 2,000 years. Alexander proved that a single human will can reshape the map of the world. But he also proved the ultimate law of physics and politics. You can conquer the earth. You can name cities after yourself. You can call yourself a god. But in the end, you cannot outrun your own humanity. The engine always stops.